Microsoft. For 4 decades, they have defined how humanity interacts with computers. When you think of Microsoft, you think of the operating system. It's their bread and butter. It's the foundation of their empire. But if you look closely at history, you realize something strange. Microsoft isn't just the world's most prolific builder of operating systems. They're also their most ruthless executioner. Today, we aren't looking at Microsoft's successes. We are conducting an autopsy. We're walking through the graveyard of abandoned kernels, killed user interfaces, and dead ecosystems. From necessary sacrifices made in the name of progress to spectacular billion-dollar blunders that handed the future to Apple and Google. Why does a company with nearly unlimited resources keep building platforms only to murder them? Is it incompetence? Is it ruthless strategy? Or is it an identity crisis that's lasted 30 years? Let's dig up the bodies. This is the history of how Microsoft killed its own operating systems again and again and again. To understand how Microsoft kills its darlings, we have to go back to a time when they were actually two different companies sharing one name. In the 90s, Microsoft had a massive problem. They had two entirely separate operating system lineages. On one side, you had the consumer line, Windows 95, 98, ME. These were graphical shells sitting on top of ancient MS-DOS architecture. They were great for games, easy to install, and completely unstable. If you looked at them wrong, they crashed. On the other side, you had the new technology line, Windows NT. This was built from scratch for businesses. It was secure, stable, and boring. Microsoft was spending vast resources maintaining two incompatible codebases. They knew that eventually one had to die so the other could live. They had to cannibalize their own market dominance to move forward. The plan was grand. Merge the stability of NT with the consumer friendliness of 9X. It took years longer than expected. Attempts like Project Cairo vaporized. But eventually, the execution order was signed for the DOS-based consumer line. Windows ME was the final, sputtering gasp of the DOS era. It was a disaster, but it was just a placeholder anyway, because in 2001, the merger finally happened. Windows XP. It was the NT kernel dressed up in Fisher-Price colors for consumers. This was Microsoft's first major kill. They successfully murdered the architecture that made them famous to establish a stable future. This was a good kill, a strategic kill. If the story ended here, Microsoft would be geniuses. But this transition emboldened them. They started believing they could dictate the market rather than just serve it. And that hubris led them directly into the biggest technological ambush in history. If killing DOS was a calculated surgical strike, what happened in mobile was a chainsaw massacre where Microsoft accidentally cut off its own leg. We have to talk about Windows Phone. It is impossible to overstate how badly Microsoft blew this. This isn't just an abandoned OS. This is the forfeiture of the primary computing platform of the 21st century to Google and Apple. And the crazy thing is, Microsoft was there first. Before the iPhone, there was Windows Mobile. It was terrible. It was literally just the desktop Windows 95 interface shrunk down onto a tiny screen. You needed a stylus to tap the microscopic start button. But they had market share in the business world. They were comfortable. When the iPhone launched, Steve Ballmer famously laughed, saying, $500, fully subsidized, with a plan? I said that is the most expensive phone in the world. And it doesn't appeal to business customers because it doesn't have a keyboard, which makes it not a very good email machine. That soundbite didn't age well. While Ballmer was laughing, Apple was redefining the fundamental concept of a computer. Microsoft was paralyzed. It took them 3 years to respond to the iPhone. In tech, 3 years is an eternity. When they finally launched Windows Phone 7 in 2010, they did something bold. They realized the old Windows Mobile was dead trash. So they killed it completely. If you had an old Windows Mobile 6.5 phone, you couldn't upgrade to Windows Phone 7. None of your old apps worked. They burned the boats on the beach. And honestly, Windows Phone 7 was kind of brilliant. It was fast, it was fluid, the live tiles interface was genuinely innovative and different from the grid of static icons on iOS and Android. Reviewers actually loved it. I loved it. But then the killings started again. Microsoft decided Windows Phone 7 wasn't future-proof enough. It was built on an old foundation called Windows CE. They wanted their phones to run on the same NT kernel as their desktops. So just 2 years later, they announced Windows Phone 8. And guess what? If you bought a Windows Phone 7 device, even a flagship launched just months prior, you couldn't upgrade to 8. They did it again! They reset their own user base twice in 3 years. They told early adopters, their most loyal fans, that their expensive hardware was obsolete instantly. But the real killer wasn't just the kernel swaps, it was the app gap. Developers were already busy building for iOS and Android. They didn't have time for a distant third place that kept changing its underlying architecture. Google actively sabotaged the platform by refusing to make official YouTube or Maps apps. Snapchat never arrived. Instagram arrived years late in a broken state. In a desperate panic, Microsoft bought Nokia's phone division for over $7 billion, trying to buy their way into relevance. It was like buying a ticket to the Titanic after it hit the iceberg. When Satya Nadella took over in 2014, he saw the writing on the wall. He tried one last rebrand with Windows 10 Mobile, promising a unified platform where phone apps would run on the desktop. It was a cool tech demo, but nobody cared. The user base was gone. The developers were gone. By 2017, Microsoft quietly announced that Windows 10 Mobile was no longer being developed. They didn't even give it a big funeral. They just stopped feeding it and let it starve in the corner. They killed their mobile future through a combination of arrogant delay, architectural indecision, and failing to understand that an OS is nothing without its ecosystem. But while the mobile house was burning down, Microsoft decided to set fire to the desktop too. The year's 2012. Microsoft is terrified of the iPad. They are convinced the traditional PC is dying and that everything is about to become a tablet. Their solution? Force the entire world to use a tablet interface on their desktops. Enter Windows 8. Windows 8 was an operating system with severe schizophrenia. It had two personalities that hated each other. You had the traditional desktop, where real work happened, and you had the modern UI, a full-screen, touch-optimized environment that was useless with a mouse and keyboard. They removed the Start button, the single most recognizable UI element on Earth. Gone. To open an app, you had to slam your mouse into the corner of the screen to invoke hot corners that didn't always work. Microsoft was so desperate to make their mobile interface happen that they sabotaged their core product to force people to use it. It was a disaster of historic proportions. But in with this disaster, there was a smaller, weirder OS that they killed almost immediately, Windows RT. Remember how I said Windows used to run on DOS and then NT? Well, both of those run on a type of processor architecture called x86, the stuff Intel and AMD make. But tablets and phones run on ARM processors. They're more power efficient. Windows RT was Microsoft's attempt to rebuild Windows for ARM chips. It looked exactly like Windows 8. It had a desktop, it had Office, but it was a lie. You couldn't install regular Windows programs on it. You could only use apps from the Windows Store, which, as we established in the phone segment, was an empty wasteland. Consumers bought Surface RTs thinking they were getting cheap laptops, only to find out they bought expensive paperweights that couldn't run Chrome or Photoshop. The returns were astronomical. Microsoft took a $900 million write-down on unsold Surface RT inventory. Windows RT was killed because it was a confusing half measure. It was the answer to a question nobody asked. What if we made Windows that can't run Windows apps? Windows 8 was eventually put out of its misery by Windows 10, which was basically Microsoft apologizing and giving us the Start menu back. But the dream of a modernized, lightweight Windows OS didn't die with RT. It just went back into the labs to mutate. Under Satya Nadella, Microsoft became more pragmatic. The mantra changed from Windows everywhere to Microsoft services everywhere on any OS. But old habits die hard. They still wanted their own modern, slick OS to compete with Chrome OS and iPad OS. Enter Windows 10X. This was supposed to be the future, a stripped-down, modernized version of Windows built specifically for dual-screen devices like the Surface Neo, and eventually for lightweight laptops. It got rid of legacy baggage. It containerized old apps for security. It was beautiful. We saw demos. Developers got emulators. Hype was building. And then the pandemic happened. The world shifted back to traditional PCs for work from home. In 2021, Microsoft quietly took Windows 10X out back and shot it before it even shipped a single unit. They claimed its best features would be folded into regular Windows. And to be fair, a lot of the Windows 11 aesthetic came from the corpse of 10X. But 10X represents a new kind of killing for Microsoft, the preemptive kill. In the past, they would launch a bad OS, let people suffer with it for 3 years, and then kill it. Now, in 2021, Microsoft quietly took Windows 10X out back and shot it before it even shipped a single unit. They claimed its best features would be folded into regular Windows. And to be fair, a lot of the Windows 11 aesthetic came from the corpse of 10X. But 10X represents a new kind of killing for Microsoft, the preemptive kill. In the past, they would launch a bad OS, let people suffer with it for 3 years, and then kill it. Now, under Nadella's ruthless prioritization, if an OS doesn't have a clear path to massive revenue or strategic dominance immediately, it dies on the vine. Microsoft still makes many operating systems. The Xbox runs a version of Windows. The HoloLens does too. Their Azure cloud servers run specialized OSs. But the dream of a monolithic consumer-facing OS that isn't just regular old Windows seems to be finally dead. Which brings us to the present day. Looking back at this graveyard, DOS, 9X, mobile, Phone 7, Phone 8, RT, 10X, it's easy to see a pattern of staggering incompetence. They missed mobile, they botched the tablet transition, they confused their customers for a decade. And yet, look at them now. Microsoft is one of the most valuable companies on the planet. How? Because they finally stopped obsessing over the OS. The ultimate irony is that the biggest operating system Microsoft supports today isn't even Windows. It's Linux, running on their Azure cloud servers. They make more money selling Office subscriptions to iPhone users and cloud space to companies running Linux than they ever did selling box copies of Windows upgrades. Microsoft killed its own operating systems because for a long time, they thought the OS was the product. They finally realized the OS is just plumbing. It's a delivery mechanism for services. The failures of Windows Phone and Windows 8 were painful, expensive lessons, but they forced Microsoft to evolve from a jealous gatekeeper of a shrinking PC kingdom into a service provider for the entire digital world. They had to kill their past selves to survive the future, even if it was messy. Thanks for watching. What's your favorite or least favorite dead Microsoft OS? Did you own a Windows Phone? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that subscribe button. We'll see you next time.